It is essential to note, however, that the water saturation percentage determined at any point in a reservoir will not necessarily be the percentage of water recovered with hydrocarbon production. This is a critical factor in wireline log and reservoir evaluation. Many petroleum reservoirs are water wet. Initially, reservoir pore spaces were filled with water, and later, hydrocarbons migrated into the reservoir to displace the water. The result is water-wet surfaces, but primarily hydrocarbon-filled voids.
The first factor that causes oil and water to mix takes effect when hydrocarbons migrate into a reservoir. The formation water is displaced, and the surface tension of water across the pore throats is too great for capillary forces to force the water out. This means that in water-wet reservoirs, there will always be a certain amount of formation water trapped and retained along rock surfaces. The saturation of this trapped water is known as the irreducible water saturation, S sub Wi. Irreducible water will plot like this on a water saturation curve in the reservoir where oil is a continuous phase. This water will not move when the reservoir is produced, and, therefore, will not show up in the produced fluid. The general association is, the lower the porosity of the rock, the greater will be the saturation percentage for irreducible water. The second factor that causes oil and water to be mixed in a reservoir is capillary action at the oil-water interface. Capillary forces within the pore spaces cause the formation water to move up into the oil column. Once equilibrium has been reached, a transition zone has been established. In laboratory tests, the smaller the capillary tube, the more effective the capillary action and the upward movement of water. Therefore, we would expect the transition zone generally to be thick in reservoirs with small pore throats, and thin where pore interconnections are large. The percentage of water that will be recovered from the transition zone depends upon the relative permeability of the reservoir rock to the combination of water and hydrocarbons that is present. Near the top of the transition zone in a water-wet reservoir, hydrocarbons will make up a higher percentage of the produced fluid. For example, as water saturation increases in a water-wet rock, it is easier for the water to move than it is for the hydrocarbons. As water saturation reaches 75%, the relative permeability to oil nears zero, and no hydrocarbons will be recovered. The remaining hydrocarbons are referred to as the residual hydrocarbon saturation, S sub OR. As stated earlier in our definition of relative permeability, when residual hydrocarbon saturation is reached and 100% water is produced, the relative permeability of the system to water is not 100% of the absolute permeability. In this case, relative permeability is 40% of absolute permeability. You can also note that in an oil-wet system, oil-water relative permeability follows the same pattern as that for a water-wet system. However, it starts with a lower irreducible water saturation and has a greater relative permeability to water as residual oil saturation is approached.